This week, something extraordinary is happening in Gaza. A wave of protests and demonstrations led by Gazans themselves, shouting this time not at Israel, but at Hamas. In city after city, brave civilians are risking their lives to chant, "Hamas are the terrorists." It's a stunning development. But really, is this a turning point for Gaza? We've seen this before, moments of resistance, like in early 2024, only for Hamas to regain power, crush the dissent, and retighten its grip. So the real questions are, is Hamas truly weakening from within? And will this time be different? Perhaps most importantly, is Israel prepared to take the necessary steps to ensure that it is? I'm Doron Spielman, and this is True East. Joining us today to go deep on these questions is Akiva Bigman, one of Israel's most fearless investigative journalists and commentators. He's a senior writer for both Israel Hayom and Makor Rishon, and a founder and regular contributor to Midah, Israel's leading current affairs platform for in-depth analysis. In the wake of October 7th, Akiva published what is widely considered the most comprehensive investigative report into the systemic failures that led to the massacre. His work has become essential reading for anyone trying to understand what went wrong and what must change. Today, we sit down with Akiva to unpack his findings and what this moment in Gaza could mean for Israel's future. This is True East. Let's get into it. Akiva, thank you again for joining us.
Sure, it's my pleasure, Doron.
So, Akiva, we're seeing Gazans once again protesting against Hamas, something that, just even a few years ago, before the war, would have been impossible, I think, to see Gazan people protesting against Hamas. What are you hearing from your sources about the scale and seriousness of these demonstrations? And is this a sign that maybe Hamas is weakening from within?
Yeah, so this is a very big question. It may be the question of the war. As far as we know, this is not very widespread. We've seen certain some kind of demonstrations. I think it's maybe more online than it is actually in the streets. In some areas where the IDF has issued called the population to move out, and then the first people to move out are the Hamas activists, and therefore their grip on the population that's left is a little bit weakened. So I don't know if we can talk about like a wide-scale protest. This is not what people in democracies really want to see in totalitarian places like Gaza or other places where we see thousands of people marching on the streets, as we see now in Israel, by the way. The opposition coming out and, maybe toppling Hamas or something like that. I think it will be premature to talk about some kind of movement in that scale. But what we can learn from these videos we see and from these demonstrations of opposition, we can learn that the control of Hamas in certain areas has weakened. I think this is what we can see from this, because we know last year, like really a year ago, was like January or February, after the major attack, the large scale attack of the IDF on Gaza, there've been protests against Hamas by certain groups. And there've been some groups of like strong men, semi-Gazan mafia groups that decided to oppose Hamas, and they created some kinds of autonomous zones in certain neighborhoods in certain areas. And what happened is that Hamas regained control of the population around March or April last year. And there were reports about that the IDF was seeing less demonstrations and less cases of civilians getting their hands on food supplies. And that was an indication that Hamas regained control of the population in Gaza. So today, when we see these demonstrations coming back again, we can understand that in certain areas, the control or grip of Hamas on the population is weakening. So I think if we're careful and we try not to use our wishful thinking too much, I think this is what we can say at this point of time.
If I'm a Gazan, Akiva, and I'm marching through the streets, I mean, I have to imagine if Hamas saw me doing this, that my life would be at risk. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure that when Hamas will regain control, if it does, in these areas, there will be consequences. But that's what we've seen in the past. That's what they just mentioned. Last year, that's what happened. So,
So
we
they
see here-
regained control. What happened to those people who were protesting once Hamas regained control?
Yeah, so I don't know the exact details about specific individuals or specific groups, but there have been gunfights, and Hamas has been executing people and detaining people all the time. So we can just assume what happened to those people. It didn't end up nicely for them, as we'll say.
So these people are brave. I mean, if they're doing this now, Kiva, then I'm assuming, on one hand, Hamas is weakened, like you're saying. Hesitantly we'll say it looks like there's a weakness in Hamas. Otherwise, they would unfortunately be killed. But they are, I guess, they're pinning their hopes on Israel. Is this connected?
Maybe they're pinning their hopes on Israel. Maybe they're thinking of other initiatives that are, in the air. Maybe return to the Palestinian Authority or others. Now, there's one thing we need to know. We need to understand about the Gazan society is that basically we do not understand them. We view the Gazans as like some kind of nationality, maybe like homogeneous bunch of people, maybe the way we tend to view ourselves. But the truth is, this is a very fractured society. It's built of different, tribes and families, hamulas, as you say in Arabic, and they have different interests and conflicts between them. It's like, the Hamas is maybe the strongest. He's like the boss mafia, but everybody else is different kinds of mafias, and they pledge alliance to Hamas at some point, and sometimes they have conflicts of interests, and they're very, very local. So part of this is also this, this complicated relationship between different fractions inside Gazan society, different families, different tribes. Some of them are different, different kinds of people. Some could be Bedouins, some could be, refugees, so-called, from Israel from 48. Some could be immigrants from Egypt. I mean, I'm not a expert on this, but this society is very, very complicated. So I'm sure part of this has to do with, a certain family that probably has a certain amount of power within Gazan society, at least, in their district. Let's say, I don't know, like a Sajaiya family with certain amount of control in their zone, their area, their territory, basically. So this has to do with the relationships between them and Hamas authorities. And so I'm not sure if, I for sure don't know, but I'm not sure if we, I mean, as a country, as the IDF, as intelligence apparatus, if we really know, what's going on exactly between these different fractions. So it's more complex than we know. And maybe, Hamas will regain control, but then he will have some kind of renegotiation of the power structure of these groups. And maybe that's what they're building on. Maybe they want to be, in a different position the day after, no matter what that day after might be. So it's more complicated than that. That's what I'm saying.
I wish that we had realized what you're saying on October 6th. I really do. And that the humility of not thinking that we are inside the Gazan mind and know what's happening is part of, what we call the concepcia for all these years. And I very much appreciate, and I believe our audience will as well, to see an expert of your caliber being humble. And within that, let's go back again to a year ago when we saw, as you mentioned, it was January, February 2024, when we saw, again, protests and there was a lot of hope out there. And then you uncovered or released a document that had been declassified, an IDF document, that said that, contrary to what the IDF was telling us at the time, that Jabalia and certain areas that control had been wrested from Hamas was back in control. And as you mentioned, we no longer saw demonstrations on the streets. And I'm assuming it's not just because all of these families are living in 5-star resorts, but because Hamas is in control. What happened between January, February 2024 until April that turn back the clock? Like, what happens so that Hamas regain control?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, because it's very important to understand what happened during the war. So in the first few months of the war, let's say till like mid-January or something like that, where the IDF was conducting its large-scale attack. They called it in Hebrew atzima. I don't know what the exact translation is. It's not really a word in Hebrew either, by the way, but it was like the large-scale attack where several divisions attacking mostly northern Gaza, Gaza City and its neighborhoods. And then what happened is that the IDF basically withdrew. They sent all the reserves home, and a small amount of forces were left to control the territory. And then Hamas reestablished its control. Now we need to understand what happened. We need to understand what was the way the IDF managed its operations. The IDF was trying. It kind of viewed Hamas as maybe a normal army, a standing army, and they were trying to. They called it lefarek. They called it to take apart or dissolve or make certain elements of the Hamas army non-functional. Okay, so they were not talking about destroying all of Hamas or killing all the operatives. The idea was to get to a certain amount of devastation, of killing operatives, of catching a certain amount of munitions or tunnels or other strategic deposits, etc. And then at some point you can say that this organization is not operative as an organization anymore. We disrupted the organization. It doesn't exist as an organization. Mm-hmm. They say there were maybe individuals left, there's still terrorists, but as an organization, Hamas in these areas did not exist. And I think the best symbol of that was a speech Daniel Hagari, the IDF spokesman, gave. I think it was like February or something like that. Was kind of summarizing up the first stage of the war. And he said that that's what they were doing. He explained everything I just said. He explained, with a presentation and videos and stuff like that, how we dismantle the organizational capabilities of Hamas. And he gave an example, Jabalia. That he really emphasized Jabalia. And he talked about the Jabalia battalion, how we dismantled the battalion and we killed this amount of operatives and we captured so much and so much infrastructure and weaponry, etc., etc.
Just for our listeners, I just want to be clear that Jabalia is in northern Gaza, and that was one of the major staging grounds on October 7th that, correct me if I'm wrong, hit both Kfar Aza. I don't know if they also hit Be'eri? Jabalia,
I think it's a little bit more north.
More north, so Kfar Aza and that area.
That's the northern, the northern part of Gaza. There's a refugee camp called Jabalia. It's a serious hornet's nest of Hamas. So they gave this example of Jabalia, how we dismantled Jabalia, and then what happens? Like around, we've been to Jabalia. There've been another 2 operations in Jabalia since. The first one, I think, was already in April or May. There was a big operation in Jabalia. After we had this major announcement that Jabalia battalion was dismantled and it doesn't exist anymore. So what happened is there was a misconception of the IDF on how the Hamas operates and what we need to do to really dismantle it. And it's not enough to dismantle it as so-called a standing army and to disrupt a certain amount of its capabilities, because Hamas is a terrorist organization that never was a real standing army, and they're not dependent on an organizational structure like the IDF. They fight from basically their home ground. I mean, the Jabalia battalion, the people who live in Jabalia. They're not recruited from all of Gaza, and they're not dependent on a line of communication or reinforcements and stuff like that. They're very local. They have their own tunnels, their own deposits, and they fight from those sections. So they don't really care about, command and control. So we killed the Jabalia, the brigade commander and other battalion commanders and whatever. They had all these different names. But, at the end of the day, the three guys sitting in a tunnel waiting for the tank to pass by, they don't really care. They don't need this command and control structure. And then what happened is, after IDF killed all these people and celebrated this, and we dismantled all these battalions, etc., etc. They're talking about like 24 battalions dismantled and whatever. But there were so many operatives who stayed in the field. And there were a lot of tunnels that were unharmed, and a lot of weapon caches and others, And once the IDF sent all the reservists home, and they were left with a small, a small force. Like the Nachal Brigade took the whole Netzarim corridor, which now two brigades take. Only one brigade. It's very small, and the whole northern of Gaza was basically got emptied out from IDF's soldiers. So the operatives who stayed in the field, they could regain control. They could reorganize, regain control, rebuild their structure, whatever they had to do. And that's what happened. And then again, in April or May, I forgot the exact date, we had to go again and have this big major Jabalia operation. And then in the summer, there's another Jabalia operation, a huge one for a long time. And there's always casualties in these places. And Beit Hanun was attacked in November. One of the first places attacked was Beit Hanun and Beit Lahi. They're the northern sections of Gaza, really next to Sderot and places like that. They were attacked and captured and dismantled. Everything was wonderful in the beginning of the war. But then during September and October, there were fierce fighting in these places and a lot of casualties for the IDF. The Nachal Brigade was fighting there, and they lost a lot of casualties. And the same thing happened. Once you withdraw, the Hamas operatives who stay in the field, they just regain control, reorganize. They're probably weaker than they were before, October 7th. They have less capabilities, less munitions. Obviously, they have less rockets, etc. We see that, but they're still able to resist. They're still able to cause damage to our soldiers, and definitely, which is most important, and now I'm reconnecting to our subject, they're still able to gain control of their own society. And that's what's important. And every place the IDF withdrew from, these people just regain control all over again. So that's exactly what happened.
So we're in the fourth. We've had 4 rounds now in Jabalia. I read your article where we were already, time has passed, where you wrote about the 3rd round in Jabalia, and now we've already had maybe 4 rounds. And one of the things you really talk about, and you mentioned it briefly here, is the tunnels, that we underestimated or looked at the tunnels as maybe simply a tactical issue, like a tactical nuisance. And I remember when I was in Zaytun with the IDF, and I saw in Zaytun, they blew up a tunnel. It was a big operation. I asked the commander, how many other tunnels are there? And he laughed. He said, they're everywhere. And I said, well, are we going to blow them all up? And this was maybe 2 months into the war. And it was, and it, almost like, no, of course not kind of look. What did we learn from this now? Do we still look at tunnels as if, apparently they went underground into the tunnels and hid and then just resurfaced. So what have we learned from that experience?
Yeah, so this is something the IDF learned during the war. Well, I can say roughly, until the war, the tunnels were viewed as mainly a threat if they support raids on Israel. Okay, tunnels let cross over the border. That was the main threat. It was taken care of after the what's called Tzuk Eitan, the 2014 operation in Gaza, and we built this underground wall. So we took care of that threat of the tunnels as a means of offense. And then in the beginning of the war, the tunnels were viewed not as a strategic holdout of the enemy, but more as a tactical threat. The soldiers, the units fighting inside Gaza were afraid people will pop up from tunnels and cause damage, cause casualties on their forces. So they did different things to cope with this tactical threat. So a lot of times, the IDF, they blew up houses or destroyed houses. A lot of times it was done because that was the only way to make sure nobody pops up from inside the house on the bottom floor. So if the house is collapsed, so whatever tunnel opening was in this house is unusable. So when the soldiers, when they move forward, they would collapse the houses behind them as a means of defending themselves from the tunnels. Most of the tunnel operations were viewed as something like this, at least at the beginning of the war. And it took a while for the IDF to understand that the tunnels were actually what's called in strategic language, it's in Hebrew you'll say merkaz koved. I just forgot the word in English for a minute, if you can help me recall. But that's like that's the strong point. That's where the enemy is. That's the enemy's strongholds you want to get control of. Okay, and that became a strategic thing that the IDF understood that it has to take care of. It's not only a tactical threat; it should be the goal of the operations. Okay, and the operation in Rafah, starting in May, viewed the tunnels as a strategic goal. That was the whole idea of regaining control of the Philadelphia corridor, was to cut the tunnels from Egypt into Gaza, and to take care of all the other tunnels there, because the understanding was that the Hamas was using the tunnels to for all its operations. I mean, that's where their headquarters are. That's where their food is, the munitions. Our people who were kidnapped or kept in the tunnels. So the tunnels were starting to be viewed as the goal of the operation. It's not only as a tactical threat, as you said.
And you had mentioned something on this point. I think you called it was in Hebrew, the balloon effect. Almost like if you press it, if you press it on one area, you squeeze a balloon, so the air moves to the other area. I mean, this was also very importantly a way for the terrorists to flee from one area to another area. And then when we went to the other area, they fled back to the original area. I mean, we know this also from Yahya Sinwar, right? I mean, Sinwar was simply moving around. And our hostages also report that they have been ferried from place to place to place to place, both in tunnels, above ground, inside of homes. And so I guess this was another consideration. However, even if a terrorist, if he flees to another area, if the IDF is not occupying and has a permanent position in the original area that they took over. I mean, if we are permanently in the original area, then I assume they wouldn't come back. But if we move on in our operations, there's always an opportunity to come back. How does this play into the whole idea of trying to destroy Hamas? I guess occupying, you called it occupying land, occupying territory, I should say. Yeah.
Right. So this is one of the failures of the beginning of the war, the first stages. Because the mindset of the idea of the strategic idea was to dismantle the Hamas as an organization, but not to destroy it totally. So they were moving from place to place and trying to attack these, the word I was looking for, by the way, is center of gravity. So they'll say there's a center of gravity in Shifa Hospital. That's one of the major operations in the beginning of the war. And most of the operations were aimed to get control of Shifa Hospital. So we had this attack on Shifa Hospital. It was a big raid, several brigades, done the whole thing, took everything out, and then they're done with this raid. And the idea was we kind of destroyed this center of gravity, so they move out. And then there's a different center of gravity someplace else, in Jabalia, so they move in Jabalia. But then